So this is, as you all know, because this is why you're here, this is one of the LSE HIEC programme, Department of Social Policy joint seminars in behavioural public policy. I know it's a bit of a mouthful, but got two sort of main parts of the LSE that sort of support these behavioural public policy seminar series. There's not many of you here at the moment, I suppose, so I'll have to make an announcement over email as well, but I'm sort of starting to put together the programme for next year as well. I know it's quite early, you might think, but it takes a bit of a time to put these things together. So if any of you do or would like to lead one of these seminars next year, then just let me know and we can arrange that. Or if you know anybody who might like to lead one, that'd be great. Just to remind you of the format, well, no, just to I'll remind you of the speaker first. Pete Lunn, who I think you all probably know, but he's the head of the behavioural research unit at the SRI in Dublin. And for many years now, Pete probably has been engaged, in that sort of interaction between academia and policy making more than almost any other person, I guess. And I think that's the perspective he's going to be offering today with his colleagues as well. His perspective on how you get across these ideas, I suppose, to policymakers and what policymakers might be looking for in this space. I think you can correct me if I'm wrong in a minute, Pete, but I think that's probably broadly along the lines of what you're going to be talking about today. Just to remind you of the format, Pete will speak for about 20 minutes and then we'll hand the rest of the time over to discussion and questions, and we'll finish at 5 o'clock sharp, London time. Okay, without further ado then, Pete, I'll hand over to you. Look forward to what you've got to say.
Great stuff. Okay, thanks very much, Adam. Yeah, so we circulated a paper. So Deirdre Robertson, my co-author's on the call. Shane Timmons, my other co-author, is on a day off because there's an extended holiday for St. Patrick's Day here in Ireland, which is tomorrow, and many people choose pleasure over work during this period, and Shane is one of them. But we've circulated a very early draft of a paper that's a kind of perspectives paper, and exactly as Adam says, the logic of what that paper is, what we're actually trying to do, is to really give a kind of practitioner's perspective on current debates in behavioural public policy. So I'll say a little bit more about our unit in a moment. I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes or so. I'll say a little bit more about our unit in a moment. And the two debates that I'm particularly going to talk about from a practitioner's perspective are just the general, what I'm going to refer to as the nudge debate. And I'm going to make some generalizations in doing that. I'll explain more about that in a moment. And I'm then also going to talk about the S-frame versus I-frame debate as well. But I'm going to take very much not a deductive analytic approach, which will be what I would describe as the sort of standard approach that you might read in a paper in behavioural public policy. But I'm going to talk about this in a much more inductive way, where I'm talking from the perspective of somebody who's working with policymakers every day, is running studies specifically for state agencies and government departments, and try to give a perspective of what work like that is like when we look at the kind of theoretical foundations, if you like, that journals like Behavioural Public Policy provide for us. We say, well, how do those theoretical foundations map onto what we're actually doing here? What are the lessons from what we're doing that map the other way, if we think of it inductively? So I'm just going to look at that relationship from a more inductive perspective. So that's the plan. We'd be delighted for any feedback on the paper that anyone has, in addition to what you might say in the kind of 40 minutes after I stopped speaking or so. So that's what I'm going to try to do. So a short and little bit about the Behavioural Research Unit here at the SRI. So an important thing to understand is that Ireland is a small country. So we are a country of about 5 million people. And not only that, but we are a very open market economy by European standards. So we have a slim public service. So it's unsurprising that the Behavioural Research Unit is not very large. So we are about 8 people. At the moment we're 9 actually, but most of the time we're around 8, mixture of experimental psychologists and behavioural economists. We're not the only behavioural research team in Ireland, but we are the biggest, despite being that size, which is very substantially smaller than you would see in, for example, the United Kingdom or the United States. That said, we've been going for about just over 10 years. We've just celebrated 10 years since foundation. And at this stage, we've run over 80 studies, about 78 experiments. We've worked for 15 state agencies in Ireland, for 6 different government departments, and we've also done some work with the European Commission and some research for the OECD. So we've done quite a lot because we've been around quite a while, but we're pretty small. And like other behavioral units, we use a combination of laboratory studies, online studies, and field trials, randomized control trials, and so on. That would be the kind of thing we do. We're probably a little bit heavier on online and lab than we are on field studies compared to most other behavioral units for reasons I have written about in behavioral public policy. But we do absolutely standard kind of nudge trials and randomized control trials, as well as other types of study. Okay, the one other thing I want to say about the kind of unit that we are that I think is important for understanding what's coming, though, when I talk about the nudge debate and about S-frame versus I-frame, is we exist within an organization called the Economic and Social Research Institute in Ireland. And the ESRI is really unusual by international standards, very unusual. It was set up by a kind of forward-thinking group of civil servants in 1960, and it was designed at a time when civil servants were very worried about corruption in Irish politics, of which there was a lot. And they set up a completely independent research organization specifically to provide research for policy for the government, but independent of government, which is a really unusual set of circumstances. So most of the research that's done in the SRI would be done in most countries inside government. And some of it might be done in think tanks and research institutes outside government, but most of it will be done inside government. In Ireland, it's done by an institute independently of government, which is why it seemed to me to be the perfect place to try to set up a behavioral research unit. But what it means is all of our work is independent of government, but it is all peer reviewed and it is all published. And everything we do is in that sense open to scrutiny. So as it were, transparency is non-negotiable for us. And I think that probably means that we come at the nudge debate with a particular perspective, because we have to be able to stand over absolutely anything that we do from the point of view of something that might alter citizens' decision-making, not just from an ethical standpoint, but because anything we do can appear in the Irish newspapers and we can be absolutely coruscated for it because it's all done in public. And that's probably a little bit different. So that's the background. That's the kind of unit we are. And what I'll now do is I'm going to talk consecutively about perspective on the nudge debate that comes from the work that we've done, and also on this more recent, shall we say, spat about the S-frame versus I-frame. So, I mean, I'm going to take that this audience knows exactly what a nudge is, that it preserves choice, but that the intervention is directional in what it's trying to achieve. And I'm also going to take as for absolute granted that the engine that really, the fuel in the engine of the nudge debate is agency. The thing that really leads people to produce papers that are arguing that certain kinds of interventions are superior to other kinds of interventions in general, in most contexts, perhaps not always, is what their implications are for agency. And I think the standard analytic framework of the theoretical papers that we read and that we read to inform our work would be that, you know, you have citizens who have a set of choices that's available to them, and you have a government who is either benevolent or believes itself to be benevolent and is trying to push its citizens towards a subset of those choices. And that's why I think the example of the food in the cafeteria is this absolutely, as it were, kind of, you know, canonical case of should you nudge, should you not nudge, and why. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about kind of the kind of studies we do and how it relates to that analytic framework and that kind of logic. You know, how big a concern is agency? Do the policy problems that we study actually map onto that framework sensibly? And I'm largely going to say that, to be honest, they don't, and that agency is rarely a major concern in the practical work that we do. It's sometimes a concern, it's rarely a major concern, and it's very rarely one that's hard to surmount. So let me explain why and where I'm coming from. So I'm going to broadly say that the policy problems that we work on go into three types. And generally speaking, we're approached by policymakers who know the kind of work we do, and they come to us with a problem. And the most common problem that we've worked on is what I'm going to call a market not working problem. These come in multiple forms, but they would typically consist of circumstances where there is an economic regulator who's responsible for a financial product, for a household domestic service, sometimes even for products that are sold in shops. And they would be basically saying, we seem to have a problem. Our consumers aren't switching to better quality products, or they're struggling to understand important elements of a product that's leading them to be confused and get something clearly wrong and make a lot of complaints. or they're falling for a particular kind of marketing trick, and we're worried that the marketing trick is leading them to buy things that are in the interests of the people who've come up with the trick and not in the interests of the consumers. And these are the typical kind of problems that people come to us with. So this might be cashback mortgages, it might be high interest loans, it might be particularly confusing attributes in health insurance products, it might be selling broadband speed using lots of kind of technical jargon that makes it sound like it's super fast when really it's meaningless. Any of these kind of problems a regulator might come to us with and say, look, we don't think our market's working very well, can you help? And actually, the most important thing to understand, if that's the most common type of problem that as a kind of behavioral team we encounter, is that that sort of analytic framework of the citizen having a set of choices and the government trying to push them towards a subset of them really doesn't apply, for the simple reason that there is a third party involved in this relationship that's really, really important. And that third party, or multiple third parties, are private companies. And for most of the problems we study, the initial relationship that we look at is not the relationship between government and the citizen, it's between private companies and the citizen, where government is concerned that private companies are taking the citizen for a ride. And that would be the most common circumstance that we would study. So of course, we don't assume that. The first thing we would normally do, rather than jump to any kind of intervention, it's very rare we jump straight to an intervention study, particularly these days. We did a little bit early on. The first thing we normally do is we try to run a diagnostic study where we do the best we can to measure the quality of decision-making within the market that's at issue. And we might do that with something like a kind of sort of multi-stage study. So an example of the kind of study we would run is we would have an online group of consumers. We would incentivize them to make good decisions and give them €100 shopping vouchers if they get the right answers to questions. We would give them, for example, some objective tasks where they had to match a usage pattern to a particular kind of service and see how well they could do it, and whether how well they could do it depended on how it was marketed, how it was displayed. Was there a particular marketing trick that made it much harder for people to match a usage pattern onto an appropriate tariff, for example, if we were looking at kind of time of use tariffs or something like that. We might also have some subjective choices in there where we've got some kind of measure of how easy is it for us to move people by using particular marketing tricks, by framing the information in different ways. And we would typically be doing that in the ways that we can see in the market, using the kind of marketing, the kind of descriptions that are actually being used in the market, and say, how much difference is it making to people's consistency of choices? How much is it meaning that if we give them an objective task to match usage to a service or something along those lines, how well can they do it? And then usually these days, what we would also do is we would give them some incentivized multiple choice questions at the end to actually get a numeric measure of how well do they understand this product and how well do they understand this market. So we get a bunch of measures of how good is the decision-making quality at the moment. And I think the reason that I'm essentially today arguing that these concerns about agency and policy don't apply very much to a lot of our problems is because what these diagnostic studies almost overwhelmingly and typically show is that consumers are greatly lacking agency already. In most of these cases, the quality of decision-making that we measure in these markets is really pretty poor. The objective measures of comprehension, we always incentivize, and by the way, we give people prizes for getting the right answers, is also pretty poor. And often it's really unwitting as well, in that the consumers actually have very high confidence that they do know how to choose the best products, but when we give them an objective test, they don't. They're all over the place. And I'm not saying that happens in all markets, but it certainly happens in a lot of the markets that we get asked to study, which are the ones that they're coming to us and saying, look, we think there's maybe a behavioral kind of problem. So what ends up happening here is that we end up then looking at different kinds of intervention, and we will use nudges, we will use boosts, we will provide evidence to support bans of certain kind of marketing activity. All of these things have happened in different studies that we've done for different regulators. We would sometimes test pre-existing information to see how good it is and to see if we can get people to pay more attention to what the regulator is already providing, or put it in different places. So sometimes just traditional information interventions, but sometimes nudges, sometimes boosts. More often than not, what we're actually going to do is we're going to say, look, consumers are struggling so much in this market, we're going to throw the kitchen sink at this, and we're going to say, you know, let's try 2 nudges, a boost, a typical information provision. Let's test all of these things and see which are the most likely to work. But the overall point that I'm trying to make here is that agency isn't a concern because consumers are at sea. And while on each case, we're going to run all of these interventions past an ethics committee here, which we always do, it's quite rare that independent people look at it and raise concerns about agency. And the reason is it's really clear that people are making errors or are struggling. And what we're trying to do is to intervene to do something about that. So that's the first kind of problem. That's the most common kind of problem we come across, the market not working type problem. The second type of problem that comes to us very regularly is problems about externalities. So classic kind of problems in this case are environmental. So we have got studies running that are trying to increase pro-environmental behaviors. We've got studies running that are trying to get people to sort their domestic waste out and, you know, not put food waste into the recycling bin, that kind of thing. And during COVID as well, we ran lots of studies that were trying to encourage people to do things to limit the spread of infection. So in each case here, we're dealing with government coming to us saying, can you get people to comply? Can you get people to do things that are in all of our interests because we've got a degree of non-compliance and this is causing some kind of externality? Again, I'd argue in these cases, certainly the ones that we have mostly done, and I know it would be possible to come up with an example where you might produce an economic welfare analysis where you'd say, well, look, the collective gain is not huge here and maybe we shouldn't be impinging upon citizens. But in the overwhelming number of cases that we study, certainly I have no qualms about trying to get the citizens involved to comply with the regulations or the rules. So I don't have a lot of sympathy for households that can't be bothered to not scrape their food waste into a recycling bin, and I don't have a lot of sympathy for a farmer who's polluting a local stream by breaking the nitrates regulations. And in these cases, I think agency is not the issue. The issue again is what kind of intervention can we put in place that's actually going to get more people to comply. And we're often looking at the collective action literature here. And it's kind of interesting how little discussion there's been of the kind of interventions on collective action and what the implications are for agency there. Things like, for example, fostering group identity, giving people clear indications of what other people are doing, their neighbors and in their space and so on. That's more common in kind of social norm manipulations and so on. But there's less discussion about the sort of agency merits of those kind of things in my experience. But maybe that's right, because if you're trying to stop somebody imposing an externality on all the rest of us, we would be less concerned about agency. So we then come to the third kind of study that we typically get asked to look at. And those are the ones that match the kind of canonical example because they're the internalities. It's the ones where you have got a situation where there's a trade-off between people's short-term interests and their long-term interests, and the government is trying to promote and has an active policy to promote long-term interests. So classic examples are diet, physical exercise, other public health preventative behaviors, saving for a rainy day to make sure you can withstand financial shocks and so on. All of these will be areas where people have come to us as a group and said, you know, can you help us to get people to make better long-term decisions? And we've run multiple studies in that space. We've run a big randomized controlled trial with one of the banks here that increased saving among low-income households and so on. We've also run multiple studies. Deirdre's on this call here, who's led our work on food choice, where we've run multiple studies testing interventions to try to get people to eat less high-fat, salt and sugar foods, for example. So there we are in the space where concerns about agency you might think are larger, because the government is clearly favoring people's long-term selves over their short-term selves if we want to adopt that particular kind of model. Again, so what I would say here is, while that's true, so we're now saying, look, we think there's a kind of, if we look at it as practitioners, it comes down to this kind of minority of studies, the areas where agency becomes a real concern. And when we have ethics committee meetings, it might get a greater discussion. I think even there, it's worth noting a couple of things. I mean, one is certainly the areas we've worked in, the survey evidence on stated preferences to back the idea that people really not only are interested in promoting their kind of longer term interests, but also think it's okay for the government to do so. And that would certainly be true in some of the work that we've done on diet, for example, and indeed on saving. But the other thing I'd say is that that kind of elephant in the room of private companies is also perhaps more important here than we sometimes think, because although often in these kind of behaviors, people are not necessarily being duped by an individual company or, you know, being persuaded by an individual, and they are clearly, and the research shows, operating in an environment where they are constantly nudged on a daily basis to eat more, eat now, buy now, pay later, and keep scrolling and keep watching. And that's happening all the time, that they're in an environment where these influences are occurring and they're overwhelmingly going in one direction. So there's a good question to ask about how much concern we've then got if the government is trying to in some way get people to pay a little bit of attention to their long-term needs when the entire environment they are in appears to be trying to make a profit out of getting them to pay attention to their short-term needs. So although it's not on the kind of individual transactional basis that it is when we're talking about the market's not working type examples, it's actually rare that we would come across a serious ethical concern about what we're trying to do that is based on people's agency. And the reason is because the environment that people are operating in, again, would seem to have everything pushing the other way. And most people, if you ask them, would think it's reasonable that the government tries to counterbalance that, tries to do something and push it the other way. Okay, so what I've given you there is if you like, a kind of overview of the kind of work that we get and how it relates to the nudge debate. What we find actually is the much more difficult issue that we have to try to solve when we test our interventions is to come up with criteria. It's not so much issues of ethics and agency, but to come up with criteria for post-intervention. How can we definitely show that the decisions post-intervention are better than the decisions pre-intervention? Now, that's the real challenge of doing the applied work. And we've got multiple ways we look at that. So, I mean, a kind of foundational paper for us that has really strong practical implication is the Bashirs et al. 2008 paper on how do we know what true preferences are, that's in the Journal of Public Economics. Now, they give 6 possible criteria. We'd add a few to that we've kind of learned over the years. But having explicit criteria for saying, we've got an intervention, we're testing it here. How can we say at the end of this that the decisions and behaviors that we observe are better than the ones that we saw before the intervention? What are our transparent criteria for doing that? That's the kind of bigger challenge. What we often do in the case of kind of market not working type studies is we look at people's ability to avoid dominated products. We look at their ability to match usage patterns to particular products that are more suitable for that usage pattern. And we also look for things that match their choices that match their stated preferences, and we look for them to do really well in multiple choice questions where we're actually explicitly testing their comprehension. And if we can see in these kind of objective tasks that people are making good decisions and that they're performing well and scoring well, our argument often to the regulator involved will be to say, well, look, in this environment, if you set up the environment like this with this intervention, we cannot be sure that people can satisfy their preferences better within this environment. But what we can see is when we give people objective tasks to do, they are better within this environment at doing it. So it would seem that there is a good logic that says if people can make better decisions where we know the answers in this environment, it's probably a pretty good bet that they're going to make better decisions where we don't know the answers because it's about satisfying their subjective preferences. Now, we would refer to this as trying to generate decision-friendly environments. And we sort of plan a paper in future where we're going to try to explicitly lay out more criteria of what we think a decision-friendly environment looks like and how one might test it. But that for us, what makes a decision-friendly environment, what is the criterion that we're using to say post-intervention decisions are better, that for us is a more important issue about what makes a good behavioral public policy than what the implications are for agency, given the contexts that we get asked to do research in. Okay, that's me on the nudge debate. I'm going to say a few things about the S-frame versus I-frame debate. So I enter these shark-infested waters. And what I really want to say is from an inductive point of view, it is undoubtedly the case that government is now coming to us more and more looking for S-frame work than it used to. So when we first started off, we were really looking at kind of studying the behavior and the decision quality of citizens and looking at I-frame, classic kind of I-frame interventions to try to help them in different circumstances. Not entirely. Quite often, some of the work that we did led to changes in regulations that had imposition upon companies. We've pre-tested regulations that have been enacted here. So every single energy company has to use a way of describing prices that we tested in our lab. That's kind of somewhere between an I-frame and an S-frame intervention, I would say. Where there is a clear imposition, and it's safe to say that the private companies really dislike the imposition. I mean, they do everything they can to try to get it away because they can see that we've pre-tested it and it's going to make a difference to the quality of consumer decision making. So, there is an S-frame element to that. But more and more, we're getting asked to do studies that I would describe as kind of pure S-frame. So to give you an example of this, we've recently done work on climate, where we've, for the first time ever, explicitly measured the public's understanding of climate science and the basic lessons of climate science. And we've then related how well they understand that climate science to their support for more radical policies, in particular carbon pricing. So is there a strong relationship there? And it turns out there is a relationship there between how well people understand the climate science and their willingness to support more radical and perhaps sometimes less popular policies like increasing the carbon tax and so on. So that's a kind of pure S-frame type study, I would argue. We've done similar work with samples of young people in Ireland, where we've looked at the issue of whether their misperception of how worried older generations are affects their willingness to take climate action. So increasingly, the climate debate is kind of contextualized as a generational thing. So you think of the kind of Greta Thunberg type effect. So we really went out to test, does that generational framework for thinking about the climate debate, is it motivating or demotivating in terms of people's policy support and willing to take pro-climate action? We thought it was a question really worth testing, and we discovered within it that actually, yeah, it can have effects. And in particular, there are a lot of young people who are now underestimating how worried older people are. And when you give them feedback about how worried older people are, what you discover is that it's more motivating for them. But all of this work now is taking place within a framework where government is coming to us saying, how can we motivate people to support policy changes and more radical policy changes? And we are doing work that is feeding into that research question in one form or another. So we're not trying to change the individual behavior of citizens. We're trying to get them to accept more radical action and more radical policy, or at least to improve their understanding in ways that might help them to do that and help them to see why it might be necessary. So on climate, that's definitely true. We've also just run a study on obesity, where we've taken a sample in Ireland, the UK, and the US, where we've looked at what people think the cause of the obesity crisis is, because our reasoning there is that if they see social and environmental causes, they might be more willing to countenance policies that try to take on the obesogenic environment and are perhaps more restrictive in terms of the environment. So if they understand different causes, does it mean they're more likely to support those kind of more radical policies? And we've looked at that across 3 countries. And we also manipulated whether people who view the obesity epidemic in a historical context as having happened over the last 50 years or so, does that historic context make them more likely to see social environmental causes and more likely to support social and environmental policies to tackle obesity rather than individual level nudge type interventions? So those are just examples, but no question, from an inductive point of view, more and more government wants us doing S-frame work, and we're very happy to do it, and we think it's worthwhile doing it. There are some risks there in terms of our impartiality and providing independent evidence, but I think those are risks that we're happy to surmount. There's then this issue, of course, within the debate about, is there crowding out? Is it the case that individual level work is somehow crowding out system level work, or that individual level policies are crowding out system level policies? Now, on the second of those, I'm not sure. And I think it's an empirical question. I don't know the answer. On the first, there's a sort of straightforward sense in which, of course, there's a degree of crowding out, because if the Department of Health is now coming to us asking us to run S-frame studies on obesity, it means we're no longer running the studies that we were running on labeling and on trying to change individual level behavior. So there's just a straightforward shift of resources of your kind of behavioral research team into an S-frame question away from an I-frame question. And in that sense, there's definitely a relationship, and we would be the perfect kind of example of that in recent years, I would argue. Nevertheless, although that's all happening, one thing I would definitely say is I cannot see circumstances in which there is not an essential role for I-frame studies, in the sense that, even if you have the most perfect S-frame in the world, our experience is that the difference in decision-making quality of your citizens and consumers is such that you need to keep running I-frame studies to help the people who struggle the most with the system, because there's an enormous variety of that, and there's going to be problems even if you design the system much better. So there's nothing wrong with running I-frame studies. For me, it's a question of balance, and that balance is shifting. And broadly speaking, I think it's a good thing that it's shifting, because I think it's pushing us towards looking at better potential solutions to really big policy problems that come to us. Okay, I've gone slightly longer than I intended to, because it's about 1:30 now. So I just want to say one final thing. So broadly speaking, I mean, you've heard the case here. We think these agency concerns, yeah, of course they're there, but how much do they actually apply to the practical policy problems we deal with? Not a lot. How much does this I-frame, S-frame debate matter? Yeah, it matters hugely, actually, and it's really changing the way we apply our behavioral science in practical terms. But I also want to just make the point that as a practitioner, I think there are really important issues in behavioral public policy about which those who are trying to provide us with really good theoretical foundations could say more. I think there are huge problems with transparency and knowledge sharing. The overwhelming majority of people who do work like I do worldwide, no one ever sees it. Sometimes the results are trumpeted in a blog post that then gets quoted by a policymaker where we've got no chance of actually looking at the quality of the science behind it. There are huge problems of transparency and knowledge sharing that I think need attention. I also think there are really big problems of open science that need attention. We now pre-register almost all of our studies and we make all the data and code available. Again, that makes us very unusual from an international point of view. And I think that is leading to policy results from teams getting put out there that are not reliable. And I think that's a big issue that we should spend more time on. There are real imponderables in there as well, where there aren't obvious right answers. I wish there was more being written and thought about multiple hypothesis testing. I don't see a consensus way of dealing with that doing policy work, and I've looked pretty hard. So I think those kind of open science questions are really important. And finally, we want to do a lot more work on what we think are good criteria for establishing when decisions are good decisions in different environments and other environments. And we're going to write a bit more about that in future, but we think that's a really important issue for behavioral public policy. So hopefully I've raised a few things to talk about there. Thanks very much for your attention. Look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Lee. That was great. That was a great, yeah, that was really, really good summary of, you know, your positioning, I suppose, in this whole field. Bob's got his hand up, but what I'll do is I'll just take the questions in the order in which you raise them. So, like Bob's given us a good example there, but if you could raise your virtual hand when you've got a question, that helps me to see it more easily. So, Bob, you got to turn you're muted, Bob. So
in your first category, Pete, when you're talking about using the accuracy of people's decisions as a kind of criterion for when regulation is required, and I always worry that there's a danger that this notion of what's an accurate decision is being, and whether consumers are able to do it, is coming from a over rationalized view. And I'm going to give you an example. I mean, one of Cass Sunstein's favorite ones is the US regulations on requiring firms to produce a mix of energy efficient cars. So they're saying that, and he says, well, we know we're requiring firms to produce more energy efficient, less energy inefficient cars. We know people make mistakes. How do we know people make mistakes? Well, it's through studying the trade-offs that people make between the price of the car and the fuel efficiency. And he said, well, we have to have these regulations because the fuel efficiency, the official fuel efficient regulations are well known. They're always on display. Consumers actually know them, but they're still making bad decisions because they're not thinking properly about it there. And on a side, and one of the sort of asides he makes is that, well, perhaps what people are very suspicious of new technologies, and that, you know, you say the official statistics say, oh, these electric cars, they're great, they have you know, how energy efficient they are, and the ordinary consumer thinks, well, that's overall, I don't really believe these statistics. I'd also, you know, there's lots of, I don't believe in these new technologies, that's what I would say. But and it seems though what the Sunstein type regulator is doing is saying, well, this doesn't count. The fact that the consumers have these reservations about you know, the consumers aren't processing the information in the way the regulator thinks they should, but the consumers actually think they're right. And so in fact, it's the regulators. So I think there is an agency question in looking at the problem from a particular perspective and then saying, oh, these consumers, although they've got the same information as we have, they're making different decisions. They must be making the wrong one. So I think there is an agency issue there.
No, right. I think that's a really, really good example of the kind of thing I mean, because the example you just raised is a kind of thought experiment that, I mean, maybe that happens in Cass Sunstein's policy world. It doesn't happen in mine, right? And the reason for that is the following, that if we get a problem like that, the first thing we would do is we would run a diagnostic study where we would look at how the cars are currently marketed, right? And we get people to make a whole bunch of choices, and we would systematically vary the different ways the cars are being marketed, the salience of the different types of fuel information. And we'd also then probably give some people a better understanding. We kind of randomize people to give some people a better understanding of how the fuel efficiency worked. We wouldn't be second guessing what the right choice is, whether you should make the, you know, the low fuel choice, whether you should make the better long-term choice of the environment. We're simply going to say, how good is people's decision-making in this environment if we manipulate the salience, we manipulate their understanding of what fuel efficiency really means, what happens and how well do they understand what they're doing? And we'll just produce a whole bunch of tests of that. Now, I think, personally, if we do that and we've incentivized our participants and they are struggling to understand, we can easily manipulate their decisions by changing the salience. And if we provide them with better information about the cars, actually, we can make really quite large shifts in their decision-making very easily. Well, at that point, I'm going to argue that they've not got a lot of agency there. They're not actually, you know, maybe they're right, maybe the policymakers are right about whether they should be choosing the more fuel-efficient car or the gas guzzler. I'm not taking a position on that. I'm just saying what I see diagnostically in the market is poor decision-making by people who don't understand what they're doing. And at that point, I can say, well, okay, well, can we test some interventions that are going to improve the quality of the decision-making? I don't need to take a position as a policymaker and say, I think people should be buying more efficient cars. What I'm actually doing is just showing they don't really know whether they're buying more efficient cars for a good reason or a bad reason, and that I can really easily manipulate them.
Well, I don't agree, but anyway.
Well, there's a big debate, though. I'll let Jan come in a moment, but it sounds to me as though it could be related to Bernheim's work, Bob, don't you think? What Pete is trying to do there? Trying to identify pure errors or something. You got your mute on again, Bob. Bob, you got your mute on.
Well, yes, you're right. It's very similar to it, and Bernheim is constantly making what I regard as that move. I think I use Sunstam because it's a prominent policy question, but Bernheim is making that move all the time of assuming that sort of judging the quality of people's choices by whether they understand discounting, you know, and is not actually thinking about how the problem seems to these people. So he's actually, although he's saying, oh, they're misunderstanding it, they aren't really evidence they're misunderstanding it.
Well, I think there's evidence they're misunderstanding it if I describe the fuel efficiency in two different ways and reframe it, and they then make radically different decisions, and I ask them a multiple choice question and discover that one of those framings they don't understand and one of those framings they do. Right now, at that point, I'm going to say, well, look, if I can see that as a scientist, why the hell wouldn't I set the market up in the way that makes it easier for them to understand?
Okay, let's move on, because otherwise I'll dominate the discussion myself, which wouldn't be right, would it? Jan, you want to come in? Jan, sorry.
Okay, yeah, thanks. So I think some of the points really resonate with me and the whole debate, but I have two specific questions to your line of work. So one is about this kind of eliciting the understanding of the choice. Is there pushback from the companies that don't like that? And what's the argument? Is this fought out in court? Like, who decides? What's the kind of their approach to your type of evidence that you provide? And the second question is about the I and the S frame studies that you say you increasingly shifts. Do you have any experience on effect sizes? So what's more effectful with regards to your target? Because I guess those S-frame studies are harder to measure in terms of outcomes.
Okay, I'm going to do those in reverse order. I mean, we're only just getting into S-frame work, to be honest. And the point you've made there, I think, is a really, really good one about effect size. Where you're dealing with things like, you know, understanding of and acceptance of policy, it is much, much harder to quantify it in a way that's useful for policy than it is to quantify, for example, how many people are going to shift from buying a cashback mortgage because they fail to understand how that trades off with the longer term cost implications versus are going to go with one that's got a lower interest rate, right? So I think the point that you're making is really good. It's much, much harder to put some kind of policy relevant effect size on a piece of S-frame work. You do end up falling back on standard psychological measures of effect size and, you know, doing it relative to standard deviations and describing something as large or small and trying to persuade policymakers of that. But it's much harder to get that to resonate. And I think the point you've made is a really good one. On the companies thing, it's really interesting, actually. I mean, Ireland's a small country, so we all kind of know each other. So often when we're doing this kind of work, we come across the companies and end up presenting in front of them and chatting to them and all the rest of it. What I would say about that is, from the regulators' point of view, the regulators we've worked most closely with have loved pre-testing stuff because it makes the regulation go through so much quicker and more easily, because the companies, generally speaking, don't try to take us on by rubbishing the research. And, you know, so there haven't tended to be legal cases and challenges. What's actually happening is when you do the research, it pushes through more easily. And I think the primary reason for that is that what often the research does is it shows that the kind of hand-waving arguments that the lobbyists are producing are not very well founded. And lobbyists are brilliant at those kind of hand-waving arguments, and the regulators are scared of them because the lobbyists, the companies, are going to say, look, we understand our customers. If you do this, the customers will do that, and so on. And these things are really influential with regulators, in my experience. We've worked with loads of them at this point, and they are persuaded by that we can see what's happening on the ground type argument. And so if we come in and test something, you know, with a randomized control trial or with a large, you know, representative sample, and we can definitely show that describing something one way leads to higher understanding, leads to more accurate matching of plans to usages and this kind of stuff, it's very hard for those kind of arguments to hold sway. So it really does make a difference.
Thanks.
Nick.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to make a couple of quick points. Very much in agreement with your sort of perspective. I mean, on the question of helping people understand the decisions they're making, I think that's a really I think that is a strong case. I mean, my you know, fairly modest compared to your experience of dealing with these kinds of problems in practical contexts is that almost always the customers are completely bamboozled, and they're not bamboozled by accident a lot of the time. They're bamboozled by design. So if you're an energy company, you spend a lot of time trying to design your tariffs and your marketing in a way that makes it very hard to work out that you're not actually very cheap, but you're never going to work it out. Or you spend a lot of time, for example, and one example I know very well is energy companies spend a lot of time putting cheap tariffs so they come up high on use switch, which are not the tariff that the person's actually going to be buying. That's not the tariff they're on, but somebody has a quick look at use switch and they think, oh, actually my energy company is pretty cheap. Look, there it is at number 2. So there's always going to be some bonkers tariff that no one's actually got on number 2 on use switch, and that, you know, those tactics are just absolutely everywhere. So I think we're living in a world where you know, the companies are using these tactics in a very aggressive and deliberate way, and they're being, you know, effectively quite misleading in their behaviour. And it's important that, you know, there are referees on the pitch to maintain order, really, and I think that seems like a very natural thing to do. And certainly my experience is that people are astoundingly confused, including me. As soon as I try and make a decision about broadband or something, I realise this is hopeless. I have no idea what's going on. So I'm very much in agreement. On the question of S-frame and I-frame, I think it is very interesting that you're getting pulled in a more S-frame direction, and that's obviously I'm all for that. And I should say that I do think that I-frame interventions can be very useful. It's just that they won't solve gigantic social problems on their own. And I suppose I wanted to just at least float the thoughts that your point that public support and transparency for what you're doing is really crucial here. Because what is a bit sinister is if it's the case that governments are thinking, we want people to think like this and support these policies, so let's try and persuade them to think like we do. And I think that's something that, you know, to some extent in public health context, we do tend to do that a bit, and perhaps we all think that's sort of fine. But perhaps if we think it's fine because we think there's a general public underpinning public support for, you know, the idea that we should all be trying to be healthier, and that research to try and work out how to engage us in healthier behaviours is good. But without that public support, without that transparency and public support, I think we're on thin ground. So I suppose my sort of background thought there is that a lot of people are quite rightly concerned about choice and maintaining freedom of choice, but one of the plural of choice is agreement. And if we as a society agree, we really do want to, you know, stop people driving under the influence of alcohol, or we really do want to stop people being lured into payday loans. And that means I'm subject to this like everybody else. If we collectively want that to happen, then I think that's a legitimate thing which societies are continually doing. That's sort of what politics is about. But it is really crucial that is as open and transparent as possible, because there is a slippery slope there, which does concern everybody, I think, in this field. And I just wonder, if you have any thoughts about how to guard against that as well as possible?
Not that you haven't really articulated, to be honest. I mean, transparency in this kind of work is everything. I mean, an example of this at the moment, I mean, we have a research program with the National Transport Authority here. They are trying to get people in local communities in Ireland to, where changes to infrastructure in their towns to reduce parking and increase bike lanes and active travel, they come across huge local resistance. We've got a research program here where they've come to us and just said, you know, help, this is part of national climate policy, we're getting this enormous resistance, help. And you might say, well, how can someone like me come in and help here when, you know, it's perfectly reasonable for local communities to say they don't want these changes? Who am I to come in and say this? And I think the fact that we have to do it transparently is really, really important. So what we are doing is, I mean, we're doing research on how people respond to these initiatives, but we're really trying to understand, you know, how much do they join the dots? What are the misperceptions? Are they actually perceiving correctly what impacts these will have on local communities? And if they're not, can we find really effective ways to communicate what the actual impacts of the change are likely to be so that people can make better decisions? Now, of course, the government is completely convinced that if we come in and do that and people can see the problem better and we can show they're understanding it better, that they'll move in their favor. Now, they might and they might not. They might be, you know, they might become more anti it, I don't know. But what's absolutely crucial and speaks to your point is, as the independent researcher who's producing that, we have to be so careful not to get identified with one side or the other and not to take a stance, that we've got an objective criterion for what we're trying to achieve, which is to get people to understand how the system is supposed to work before they make the judgment. And that we've got an objective criterion for saying what that consists of and what our intervention is attempting to do, that if, you know, a journalist got hold of it at the design phase and looked at it, and we said, look, this is what we're doing and why, and it was completely transparent, that, you know, you could very easily stand over and say, yeah, that's a reasonable thing to do. We are helping communities to make better decisions about what communities look like, rather than we're doing the government's bidding and trying to persuade everybody to sign on to their policy. But that is exactly the issue.
Thank you, Graham.
Right, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, I can't put my video on because it just starts blinking. It'll induce epilepsy in somebody. So I'll just speak from behind this avatar. Pete, I think this is very interesting stuff, but I have a couple of questions. I'm particularly interested in the market not working aspect of it. And somehow or other, the regulators or people in the public sector, they identify that they think the market is not working. Do you or they then try to make some assessment at that stage of the degree of consumer detriment? And then I think, if I've understood you correctly, so that's the kind of level of detriment as it's perceived by them or measured by you in the sort of in the before state, the state that needs attending to. And then you do these experiments. One of the things that sometimes worries me about these experiments is that they're artificial, in the sense that if people know they're part of an experiment and you're providing these incentives and you're getting them to think very hard and you're getting them to focus on things, then a lot of the things that actually go wrong, as it were, with consumer decision making in the real world is that they don't know, they're not thinking, they're not attending, they don't have these particular incentives, they don't know they're part of an experiment and that people have expectations or demands on them. So you can't really be sure that what they do in these experimental circumstances will work when you try and translate it back out there into the world. But when you do try and translate it back into some kind of intervention in the world, do you then have some means of measuring the after consumer detriment, which you can compare with the before intervention consumer detriment? And if so, in what sort of metrics are these consumer detriments before and after measured, so that you can evaluate the success in the field of these interventions?
Okay, so those are great questions. Typically, so in answer to the first one, typically when a regulator comes to us, they don't have a measure, they've got a hunch. So a classic example here, and I'm going to use this example to answer both of your questions actually, is the electricity regulator here, or the energy regulator was worried about electricity tariffs. Came to us because Ireland opened up to competition, and the further we got away from the opening up to competition, the more people were moving to the most expensive electricity provider. Now, they hadn't got a measure of consumer detriment or any kind of technical economic analysis. They were just watching their market move to the most expensive provider and going, this is not what was supposed to happen when we opened up to competition. Why is this happening? So they come to us. Now, we run a diagnostic study that tries to get some numbers on that. And we thought that the reason was price transparency, going back to the point that Nick was making a few moments ago. Consumers appeared to us to be very confused. The way that prices were being marketed had a particular way of describing discounts that we thought was particularly confusing. So we run a whole bunch of experiments where we can show that if we give people incentivized choices, what we find is that they are much more likely to choose cheap electricity and the cheapest provider if we, as we would think of it, uncloud their preferences by making the price transparency more straightforward. We can see they've got a real direction of travel towards people that are charging lower unit rates. Once they can see that those are lower unit rates, we can put a percentage on that, so we can see, what kind of proportion of people are now making a different decision to the one they're making earlier. And the consumer detriment is kind of obvious in that case, because people are literally just paying for a company that is providing them with exactly the same product, and it's more expensive. And they're moving to it. And when we give them the opportunity and they realize it's not more expensive, they would go the other way. So it's not that they're doing it because they like the brand or they like the customer service or something like that. Is there a degree to which we're second guessing people's preferences there? A little bit. But to be honest, looking at the empirics, it's pretty damn clear what consumers are trying to do and that the effect size is quite large. And, you have to look at the paper and judge it based on the paper as to how persuasive you think that is. But certainly as scientists, we're pretty convinced, having run the study, that that's what's going on. Then when it comes to testing and intervention, so actually the regulator didn't go with the intervention we wanted. They went with a different intervention. It wasn't one that was possible to test in a field trial because we can't randomize people to get different kinds of marketing on billboards in Dublin. So we ran a laboratory style study where we randomized people to get the intervention or not. But that had multiple phases. I mean, that had a kind of objective matching task in it. It had a subjective choice task in it where we could see that the intervention was going to make people push more towards buying electricity with lower per unit rates, and we could put some numbers on that, how many people would do that. But one of the things we also did was we had people just rate things for pure value. Could they actually see which the cheapest electricity was based on adverts that either had the intervention or didn't, to see, were people being confused by marketing, or could they make a better objective decision about which the cheaper was, regardless of the brand or whatever it happened to be, if we put the intervention on standard marketing. So you put all those things together. I've got a lot of sympathy for your point in the sense that there is no guarantee at all that when that went into the market, in the confusion of the market and the complexity of the actual real world market and all the things, when I'm trying to choose my 5-year-old dragging on my cardigan, trying to stop me staring at a computer, switching electricity packages and get me to pay attention to getting them dinner or whatever, in that messy real world, did people's decisions improve? Well, my study doesn't show that, but I think if the intervention didn't jump the pre-test hurdle that we'd set, where we can show you're less likely to fall for bad marketing, you are better able to match a usage pattern to a tariff, and you're more likely to push towards cheaper electricity. Well, if it doesn't jump that hurdle, they definitely shouldn't put that intervention in. When it gets into the messy real world, does it work? Well, the regulator would tell us now that it has made an impact. So if they look at the churn in the market and they see how people are moving, they would say, yeah, it's got people moving less to the most expensive company, more to the cheaper companies. I don't control those numbers. So yeah, sure, you produce an evaluation afterwards of what impact the intervention appears to have. But I think in many ways what our study does is it kind of puts a hurdle that says, well, look, the intervention's got to jump this hurdle. And if we can see that it's effective when people are paying attention, well, we can make a judgment and we can put it out there and then we can see whether it works if we can't run a randomized control field trial to actually test it in the messy real world. So that's the way that worked.
Okay, Malte, who looks like he's carrying some produced surplus at the moment.
Yeah, here. She has a question. No, just great presentation, Pete. Just a quick question. So you said often the hardest is sort of the post-intervention evaluation, right? And you referred explicitly to the Bashir's et al. Paper. And I was just wondering, I mean, don't you have to identify people's preferences to begin with to identify sort of a reasoning mistake? I mean, I understand your point. I mean, there might be obvious cases where we sort of second guess, as you just said, their preferences and just assume them. But I mean, I just wonder about the order, you know, when we are actually talking about the need to identify people's preferences. And I understand you have to do it at some point for sure when you want to evaluate what's going on, but also for the need to intervene, right, to begin with.
Okay.
Or did I? Yeah, that's
so
just a conceptual question.
No,
yeah.
you've put your finger on exactly what the difference in perspective is going to be here between me and you. It's perfect, right? Because I think you can do this work without second guessing people's preferences to a very large extent. And the reason I think that is because we can put in place a diagnostic study where we can show how easy it is to manipulate people's choices and produce inconsistencies or get them to purchase dominated products where there's no realistic preference. So we don't have to say how well are they satisfying their preference, what is their true preference. What we can say is the environment in which they are making the decision is one in which I can easily make them make objectively poor choices, right? And if I can improve that environment in a way where people are likely to make fewer objectively poor choices, where they themselves generate a clear direction of travel, perhaps towards, for example, something like cheaper electricity. And when I ask them comprehension questions, they understand what they're doing better than they did previously. Well, I think I've got a pretty decent bit of evidence for policy that that's a better environment for people to make decisions in, even though I've got no idea what their true preferences are, and I haven't attempted to measure them. I might have done some stated preference work in there, but I might not. But I still think I've got pretty good evidence that I've got a better environment in the second case than the first case. So that's, from a kind of inductive point of view of the kind of work we do, this is exactly the point I'm trying to make. That most of the problems we come across, that's the kind of thing that we do. And it seems just pretty unarguable that the environments in which we have people making choices post-intervention are better environments. They're just more decision-friendly. And there's multiple ways you can show that.
Seems as though you're doing a lot of boosting rather than nudging, Pete. But
we do both. But interestingly,
Yeah.
one thing I didn't say enough of is a lot of our interventions have got multiple. I mean, our savings intervention had 2 boosts and 6 nudges in it. And I think one of the reasons effect sizes for nudging are so small is because we don't throw enough of them at the problem at the same time.
All right, Lee can have the last question today, Lee.
Thank you. See if there's time to answer it. So the Financial Conduct Authority in the UK, as many of you will know, has implemented a new rule called the consumer duty. This gives, it asks firms to look at biases in their customer behavior and customer decision making, and to basically it says you have to ensure good customer outcomes. And it asks companies to provide evidence for that, which includes, for instance, running behavioral experiments to see if their customers are biased. So, one, do you think this approach, which it leaves a bit more of the standard setting to the firms rather than the regulator? It kind of says ensure good customer outcomes, but it doesn't really define in a lot of detail what those are. Is that argument potentially better? And but does it risk the fact that the firms are conducting their own testing rather than they may be commissioning someone like us to do it, but it's not being run independently? Does that risk the firms being their own policeman? Is that going to cause introduce a new source of bias?
Lee, that's a great question, and I think. I feel like I don't really have the expertise to answer it. I've only got a hunch. I mean, the obvious analogy to make is drug trials, right? Where provided they're run to a certain standard, companies can conduct drug trials. And for some time now, I have wondered whether there is a model of financial decision-making in retail financial markets that one could adopt, where if a new product comes along in retail financial markets, a new kind of investment product, for example, that the onus is on the company to test it to a certain standard and show that their consumers do understand that product and can make sensible choices between them. And if we move towards a better idea of what a decision-friendly environment looks like, could you produce kind of standard tests for these kind of things that would allow you to regulate in that kind of way, just like people regulate drugs? I think it's a great question. I don't know the answer to it, but I totally get it. And I think potentially the answer could be yes, but I really don't know.
Great. Okay. I think we've reached the time for today. Thanks for that, Pete. That was really great. Thanks so much for presenting today and taking the questions. And thanks for all the questions as well, which were also great. And I hope you got a little bit out of it, Pete, at least.
I certainly did. Yes, thank you very much. Yeah.